Ladies and gentlemen, may I kindly ask you to take your seats, please? Our panel is about to start. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, our first two panels will be moderated by Sami Zeidan. The first panel is entitled Geopolitics of Transition. I would like to invite our moderator, Mrs. Sami Zeidan, journalist with Aljazeera News. Mrs. Zeidan, the floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let's try this again and wake everybody up. I know we've had a good breakfast, but we're going to have an even more tasty and interesting session. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. All right, wonderful. Welcome to the Aljazeera session of the Bosphorus Summit, dedicated to discussing some of the geopolitics of the energy challenges and transition facing the world today. I'm Sami Zeidan, senior presenter with Aljazeera International. It's my absolute pleasure to be with you here again this year, to be your moderator for this session. I often have the honor and pleasure of being the moderator for the Foundation's high-level international discussions, both in Qatar and globally. Now, for those of you who are new to the Foundation, allow me to introduce and highlight that the Abdullah bin Hamad Al Atiyah International Foundation for Energy and Sustainable Development is a non-profit think tank which regularly brings together some of the finest minds, key stakeholders from the world of business, government representatives, and members of the world's most prestigious academic institutions to explore the way forward on global energy matters. It is truly a unique initiative which builds upon the chairman, His Excellency Abdullah bin Hamad Al Atiyah's 40 years of service in the energy industry. His vision was for the Foundation to provide a platform for knowledge exchange and thought leadership that supports the global quest towards a sustainable energy future. And I must say, having had the pleasure of moderating several of these sessions, it is doing a remarkable and unique job. Well, today's two back-to-back sessions will be presented by a panel of 6 international experts who will provide some insights into many of the difficult issues facing our planet with respect to a transition to a low-carbon, sustainable energy future. To discuss the best strategies to decarbonize energy production, we'll also explore which technologies can be implemented within the desired timescales. We'll look at evaluating the predicted energy mix scenarios. We'll debate how the CO2 reduction targets can be balanced by the needs of developing economies in reaching those all-important United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, especially I'd point out Goal 7, which is to ensure universal access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy by 2030. We'll also explore the geopolitical consequences of climate change and the reordering of sources of energy. We'll be hearing shortly from a panel of distinguished speakers whose slides will be available for you on the Foundation's website in case you haven't been able to take note of it. The web address is printed at the bottom of these banners here on the right and left sides of the stage, www.abhafoundation.org, which is abhafoundation.org. So please do make sure you have a look at them. Allow me now to introduce our speakers for today's 2 sessions. We have three of them already up here on the stage for the first session, and 3 more will be joining us later. We're absolutely delighted and honored to have such a rich mix of some of the most astute minds and impactful hands when it comes to energy issues. Ladies and gentlemen, this panel brings together people representing some of the greatest influencers and shapers of the global energy landscape. And I think That makes these two sessions really unique, really interesting, and really important. Let me introduce first Professor Paul Stevens, who's sitting up here on the stage. He's a distinguished fellow of Chatham House at the Royal Institute of International Affairs. I'm sure you all are familiar with Chatham House. Professor Paul is also a consultant for several governments and leading companies around the world. He literally helps to shape the global energy policies of leading quarters. We are truly honored to have him with us here today. We're also delighted to have Dr. Cyrill Widdershoven. He's the founder and senior advisor of Verocy, Geopolitics and Country Risk. Now, he is a veteran global energy market expert. He lectures at some of the world's finest universities in at least 3 continents I was able to count in a chat with him last night. And he's worked for some of the world's leading institutions, ranging from Deloitte to Capgemini Consulting. So truly a pleasure to have you here with us too. We're also honored to have with us Akito Matsumoto, senior economist of the Commodities Unit at the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. I'm sure the IMF needs little introduction. Mr. Akito helps to guide the energy and climate change policies of the world's arguably most influential global financial institution. He's also regularly published in peer-reviewed journals. We're absolutely honored and delighted to have his caliber with us here on the stage today as well. Let me also introduce to you the speakers of our the second session. We will be hearing from Professor Michael Grubb. He's Professor of Energy and Climate Change at one of the world's leading universities, University College of London. Professor Grubb, I might point out as well, is also one of the leading advisors to the government of the United Kingdom on climate issues, and therefore directly guides a global powers approach to climate and energy issues. He's also the lead author on the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So we're absolutely honored to have, as I said, yet another distinguished person who advises, who shapes some of the global energy policies facing the world today. We're also delighted to have with us Robin Mills. He's Chief Executive Officer of Qamar Energy. Now, Robin is also a non-resident fellow at Columbia University in the USA, one of the world's most prestigious academic institutions. Robin has a long and distinguished history of helping to reshape Middle East countries' gas markets, and I'm sure he's going to be giving us some insights into that later when he speaks. And we're also honored and delighted to have with us Aziz Qasim. He's Vice President of Development at Accelerate Energy. Now, Accelerate, you may or may not know, has pioneered floating regas LNG import terminals. Again, another brilliant mind with another powerful hand that is literally reshaping the world of energy as we live it today and will live it tomorrow. We're absolutely delighted and honored that you've had time to join us, sir. We are, I hope, clear now that we have a panel of people who not only represent some of the finest minds in thinking about the energy industry, its transition, and the new mixes, but also people who have practical say and input into shaping that very world and revolutionizing the world that we're living in. Let me also point out before I hand over to our first speaker that we do have translation available in English, Arabic, and Turkish, so feel free to avail yourselves of the headset if you want to listen in a language other than that of the speakers. I would also kindly remind everyone to please keep your phones on silent. We will be hearing from each of our speakers. I will invite them up to the podium to speak for around 10 minutes. I'll be helping them with some timing cards so that they can keep track of time. And following each session, we should have time for 15 minutes of Q&A. And I would like to really encourage everyone to engage and don't hesitate to bring forth your questions. I often think that the best part of any session is that in which we interact with the audience and we get the creativity flowing. So without further ado, let's start our first session on the topic of the geopolitics of the energy transition. Join me in welcoming Professor Paul Stevens from Chatham House, who will address us on the podium on the energy transition and the new geopolitical implications it has. Let's welcome him.
Where's the clicker? Good morning to everybody. Where's my clicker? Somebody's walked off with it.
Oh, very strange.
Aha.
There you are.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody again. Thanks for the introduction, Sami. I need to talk about the energy transition and the implications for geopolitics in 10 minutes, which is quite a challenge. In order to organize my thinking, I need to start by saying, well, the energy transition is going to change geopolitics. So change it from what? What were the old geopolitics? What were the geopolitics that dominated in the 20th century? I then want to look at the current energy transition, which is a switch away from, I describe it as a switch away from hydrocarbon molecules to electrons, in other words, away from oil, gas, and coal to electricity. And I want to look at that in a little bit of detail and then think, well, what are the geopolitical implications of this transition? And there are two stages to it. First of all, what happens during the transition, but also what happens at the end of the transition. Okay, let me then start with the geopolitics of the 20th century. They arose quite simply because the energy resources were concentrated in a few countries. And you can see from here on the right-hand side we have oil reserves, which hardly surprisingly is dominated by the Middle East. On the left we have gas reserves, which tend to be dominated by the Middle East and Russia. And in similar vein, if you look at coal reserves, again, you see a situation where a few countries dominate the supply. Now, the implication of this uneven distribution of resources is you get competition and conflict for access. And access to those resources endows power. The classic example of this, my favorite example, is Great Britain. In 1912, the Royal Navy switched from fueling its warships with coal to oil. For a lot of very sensible logistical reasons. There was a problem, however. Britain had a lot of coal, it didn't have any oil. And you can make an argument that says that after 1914, much of British foreign policy was driven by the need to get oil from the Middle East in order to fuel the Royal Navy. There were other factors as well, of course. So, into that situation, we now have the energy transition. And an energy transition is when an economy switches from one main source of energy to another. I've got a couple of examples up here. On the top right, we have the United States, And the two transitions there, the one that I like is the one from 1865 to 1900, when the US went from 80% wood, 20% coal, to 80% coal, 20% wood. The reason I like that particular transition is if you go back to the contemporary literature of the time, the newspaper articles, the journal articles, it's all going on about the impending energy crisis. We are running out of wood. It's going to be the end of life as we know it. And for any of you familiar in the 1990s with the peak oil nonsense, the argument we're running out of oil, which was incidentally an idea invented by geologists to upset economists. Boy, did they succeed in that particular activity. Again, you see the change. The bottom right-hand diagram is the more recent example and happened over a much shorter period, and that is the example of France, when they switched away from oil and coal to generate electricity into nuclear. Now, if you look at the pattern of energy transitions, and there are many other examples, you can see a certain pattern developing. First of all, you have a trigger which starts the process. But once that trigger has been pulled, you then begin to see what I call reinforcing factors. And these reinforcing factors tend to be based around technology, leading to change in relative prices. Now, the current energy transition, as I say, is moving away from hydrocarbons to electrons. The triggers for this were essentially environmental. It started by concern about climate change and the need to move to lower carbon economy. But in recent years, especially in parts of Asia, issues of urban air quality are beginning to come to the fore. And the reason for this is very simple. You don't need a panel of international scientists to tell you it's bad for you. All you have to do is try and walk down the street, or get your kids to walk down the street, and you realize there is a problem there. Now, once that trigger had been pulled, other reinforcing factors come into play. The first is the falling cost of renewables. Again, here we have technology coming into play. The rise of electric vehicles, penetration of electric vehicles into the car fleet, also the technology associated with the fourth industrial revolution. And I would add a fourth reinforcing factor, which is growing concern over the potential for geopolitical oil price shocks coming out of what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. Now, a key uncertainty with this transition is the speed of the transition. How fast is it going to happen? It is my personal opinion that what I call the energy establishment, the IEA, OPEC Secretariat, the EIA, and the large international oil companies are seriously underestimating the speed and depth of this current transition. The reason for this is manyfold. There are certain vested interests. For example, it's very difficult for a big international oil company to write a letter to the shareholder saying, "Dear shareholder, it's been nice knowing you, but if you've got any sense, you'll take your money somewhere else." Also, as well, you have what I call vested interests, which create a sort of intellectual inertia. If you've been arguing for a long time that oil demand is going to rise forever and ever, it's kind of difficult to change that tune. Also, as well, I think many governments are underestimating the political groundswell for change. By contrast, the financial community, I think, is being much more realistic, and you only have to look at the Divest campaign to see the truth of that. Now, it's legitimate to ask the question, why does the speed of the transition matter? Well, it matters because the energy transition is going to be disruptive. The faster the transition happens, the greater the disruption is going to be. Now, what are the implications of this for future geopolitics? I'm going to turn the stages round and start with after the transition has been completed, as we reach the sunlit uplands, as it were, of the new world. The point about renewables is that they can be small-scale, decentralized, and everywhere. In other words, the old geopolitics of energy, which were based upon resources being concentrated in a few countries no longer applies. Of course, there are going to be certain geopolitical issues. There's concern about access to certain minerals for batteries, although I personally think that's grossly overstated as a problem. There's also potential conflict over interconnectors. One of the problems with renewables is the intermittency or variability, and this means that you're likely to see more trade, international trade, in electricity. There's concern about cyber attacks on electricity systems, obviously, as a factor, and there's also issues to do with IP disputes. But the old geopolitics of energy surrounding conflict over access will be gone. However, there is a problem getting to stage 2. In other words, what happens during the transition? The imperative for the hydrocarbon exporters is the need to diversify their economies. And if one looks around the world, there has been a failure of most of the hydrocarbon exporters to diversify. Now, I could give you a 5-hour lecture on this, but I won't, to explain why there has been this failure of diversification. Essentially, it's due to the political system. It goes back to the debate in the Soviet Union of Gorbachev's time between perestroika and glasnost, economic liberalization versus political reform. And for many of the hydrocarbon exporters, you're not going to have economic liberalization without an active private sector, and an active private sector is unlikely to emerge without political reform. The faster the transition, the greater the disruption is going to be, and potentially it could lead to a complete destabilization of the Middle East. Let me finish with my main messages. Forget straight-line forecasting for energy. It's not going to happen. You're going to be increasingly looking at discontinuities and so-called black swan events. It's not going to be a smooth ride. Eventually, however, the old geopolitics of energy will be gone. I've no doubt that we will find other reasons to kill each other in the nature of the beast, but it won't be necessarily over energy. And finally, I leave you with, for anyone interested in more detail, because what you've had is a series of heroic generalizations flying in loose formation. If you want a little more analysis, I put up there my recent report from Chatham House, which is available on the Chatham House website. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Wonderful. You've left us really with a lot of food for thought there. It's already generated a bunch of questions in my mind, and I'm sure it has in the minds of the audience. So I just want to remind everyone, hold on to those thoughts and questions. When we come to Q&A time, we really want to see some interaction from the audience. We want to see some lively questions posed. Let me then thank Professor Stevens, and let's now invite to the podium our next speaker. We're delighted to introduce Cyrill Widdershoven to address us on the new risk to the energy sector. Let's welcome him.
Hello. I love to disagree. I love to be called old-fashioned, and I love to be called I'm a hydrocarbon dinosaur, because things are in flux, and Houston, we have an issue, but the issue is most probably is not going to be energy transition only. The main issue is that we are being educated to think that oil and gas is over, that demand for oil and gas is not going to be 140 million barrels, as ADNOC said in 2018. that demand for oil and gas is going to be flat in 2027, 2028. I've heard it all before. Since the 1970s, oil was finished, gas was finished. It's now 2019. Demand for oil and gas has never been as high as it is right now. Demand for oil and gas is going to grow, and it's maybe not going to hit 140 million barrels, but to make clear, demand for oil and gas in the last century has never gone down. It's still up, it's still growing, and as long as emerging markets, China, India, Africa, even in Saudi, demand for energy, demand for oil and gas is growing. Also, do not forget, we are only focusing on oil and gas because we see it as energy. Oil and gas is not only energy. Oil and gas is almost in every single thing that you are eating, wearing, your shoes, your coats, your mobiles, etc., is oil and gas. So, but thanks to energy transition and thanks to other issues, we are heading for a crisis. And the crisis is not related to wind energy, solar energy, nuclear energy, biomass. It's related to an issue that most of the people that are analyzing the energy transition are not focusing on. You need to finance energy transition, you need to finance oil and gas. And if there is an issue in finance, nothing ever is going to happen if there is not the cash to do this. So normally every single energy operation is looking at a risk profile that's like this. Is there oil? Is there wind? Is there sun? Is there gas? Is there coal? Now, yes, we have. Environmental risk, that's in the news. That's every single day on the front page. CO2 emissions, etc., global warming, global heating, whatever, and people forget that everything needs to be financed. Right? Is it now? Yeah, it's right. Every single prediction says that demand for energy will be growing. Every single prediction estimates that up to 2040, oil and gas will be the main supplier for energy. And every single assessment of 2019 shows that the growth of renewable energy does not counter the growth in demand, of energy in the whole world. We still need more oil and gas to even counter and provide the energy demand that we are seeing. And this will stay for the next years. Wait. Because I see that it's going to go quicker, so I'm going to just go through some of the slides, we need, and that's an estimation, up to 2040, 13 to 18 trillion US dollars investments in oil and gas only. 18 trillion, it's more than I'm having on my bank account, and even I think that most Arab leaders are not having it. Also, demand, we are looking most often demand in Europe, demand in the US. Demand in Europe has been flat, which means demand is not down. Demand is flat. Demand for gas is even up. Demand for oil is flat in Europe, with all our environmental strategies, subsidies for EVs, etc. Demand for energy, demand for oil and gas is still the same as it was the last 5 years. If we are going into energy transition in Europe, which should mean Eastern Europe will substitute from coal to something else, we have the only option available right now, which is feasible, to go from coal to gas. Wind and solar in Northwest Europe are not feasible to counter the demand at all. However, for people, oil is the largest sector in the whole global economy. There is not one single sector, so it's not Apple, it's not Internet, it's not Google, it's not Alibaba. Keep in mind, oil is the largest sector and needs a hell of a lot of cash every year to even keep it up. Now we are looking at the good, the bad, and the ugly. For you, it's to decide who is the good and the bad. For me, it's clear they are not on my screen. Yeah? However, if we are talking about oil, if we are talking about emissions, if you are talking about global warming, we always see these two. It's the US is leaving, the world is going down, and the other one is accusing everybody older than 25 to ruin the whole world. We are heading for a perfect storm, and the oil and gas ship is heading for it. Why? Because we are doing this. We are taking out financial means to the oil and gas sector which are necessary, even, now I have 1 minute, even to keep up the global demand for hydrocarbons. And hydrocarbons, as I said, it's not only energy. Oil and gas, people, it's not only energy. Please keep that in mind. But in the good and the very nice assessments we read in the West, every single financial institution, banks, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, are forced to divest their investments in oil and gas. That's good if you really think we can deal with everything that we need by wind and solar. My 8-year-old is always asking myself, How are we getting my time is up, I end here. How are we getting electricity during the night when in the Netherlands there is no sun? The only other option is the heating will come from gas. But my time is up, so I will quit here. Yep.
Thank you very much indeed, Cyrill. You've also left us with a few points, not least of which is, I think, the big question of why we're heading towards that crisis if demand, as you so eloquently pointed out, is set to increase. We'll have perhaps more time to get into that when we get into Q&A. I won't ask you who's the good, the bad, and the ugly of those photos you drew up, though. Let's welcome to the podium now Mr. Akito Matsumoto. He will talk to us about the energy transition uncertainty. Let's welcome him too.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Akito Foundation, for inviting me to talk about this one. So, the theme of this summit is towards the New World Order, and I can talk about towards New World Order of energy market, which is basically the energy transition. So key points of my talk is what is the new world of energy market? So what kind of energy mix should we see in 20 years later? That's first question. So there's energy transition going on, but what kind of share or what kind of speed that Paul has emphasized we're going to see. So this is the topic. So in short, in main scenario that we're not going to see any dominant fossil fuel, so natural gas, oil, and even coal play the important roles. Natural gas is expected to increase its share in primary energy, while oil and coal are expected to lose compared to the current stage. Renewable will be important, but progress on technology affects its role. I can talk about this in later. So what determines their roles other than the economic growth? Of course, economic growth is the most important factor in terms of energy demand, other than, of course, population growth. If you look at population growth and energy, economic growth, it's almost one-to-one relationship. But then there's other determinants. First one is policy, carbon tax, trade policy, environmental regulation. That's going to affect the share of these fossil fuel and renewables. And of course, technology. Carbon capture and utilization storage, and battery and hydrogen technologies are quite important to determine these energy share. So this is the recent trend of energy share, which Professor Stevens already covered in detail. So in terms of forecast, this is coming from so-called energy establishment IEF, which is not my affiliation. This is third party for me, so I can criticize whatever I like. But let's use their numbers. So compared to 2017 numbers, you can see that basically coal, oil, loses its share, while gas gains share, and even that the three different scenarios that they put, new policy scenario, which is basically that the government takes that this policy which is stated already, and CPS is that the current policy scenario that even if government said, we're going to stick to the Paris, that they disregard this and they assume as if that everything is as same as today. And the SDS is sustainable development scenario, which is in line with sustainable goal scenario with the temperature of 2 degrees Celsius scenario. So with policy uncertainty, natural gas demand is expected to be quite same in regardless of scenarios. This is one notable nature of this forecast. While other renewable, which is basically solar, wind, geothermal, their share is quite different. So this is one takeaway that you should remember in terms of future. Depending on the policy, renewable is going to be different. Natural gas demand is relatively stable. So the reason why that natural gas demand is relatively stable, of course, there's decarbonization, cleaner energy, the transition towards that. So of course, natural gas is cleaner than coal and oil. Of course, that in order to achieve position that there's huge environmental issues will get attention, methane leakage issue of natural gas is important aspect because Europeans care about this one, and this can affect trade. And the part of the reason that natural gas target of divestment is coming from methane leakage. And but natural gas is of course cleaner, and the other future technology can affect that its demand a little bit more, that the blue hydrogen can be an important role for natural gas. Coal is losing role, but CCUS can potentially save coal. In terms of oil demand, I see that it's going to peak demand in terms of volume. Not growth rate, we are in 2 years ago that in this summit, we stated that the growth is going to slowing down. But we calculated a little bit more carefully when it's going to have that growth rate is going to hit zero, basically. And we see that potentially it's 25 years later is that kind of main scenario, but of course there's a lot of uncertainty, and even some other than us saying earlier years. By the way, this statement is my own, not IMF's view, so it's just my own view. So do not take it as IMF prediction. So role of fossil fuel and renewable, it's competition or complement. So in terms of some sector, of course, it's competition that for electricity, renewable, and the coal or natural gas, it's competing. But as Cyrill said that in night that we need electricity that not coming from solar, we need natural gas. So it's in some sense it's complement. So this share can be decided by battery technology and CCUS technology as well as hydrogen. So in terms of technology, that these three things are that we are paying attention. Battery. Why battery? That in order to have renewable energy as a dominant role in the future, we need a solid state battery so that we don't have to worry about that the cost of battery and impact on that the dirty batteries that coming from lithium, cobalt, and you can make it large scale. So that battery technology is very important for renewable. Carbon capturing is very important for fossil fuel, of course. And we really need point of source carbon capturing in, let's say, power plant or cement plant and steel plant. Especially power plant that even if we don't build any new coal plant, it's still going to be emitting a lot of CO2 in 20, 30 years later. So we really need to retrofit these existing power plant. And potentially it's desirable thing is the point source that at the residential level, and also that the direct air capture could be nice things. But in the 20, 30 years horizon, that it's a little bit hard to dream. The other technology, its importance is hydrogen that can come from natural gas or that can come from water that is used by the excess electricity coming from renewables. The biggest uncertainty for me is, of course, policy. The carbon tax and border adjustment tax, this can potentially have a lot of implications in terms of economic growth for emerging countries and carbon producer. This is completely my view, but potentially, let's assume that the EU is going to introduce carbon tax. Then they're going to use this as carbon tariff towards other countries which is not introduced carbon tax. That's going to create basically that the threatened free trade, and that's part of the risk that can affect economic growth of global growth, and also distribution of income between the carbon producer versus carbon consumer. So that's going to be a really issue in the future. The other, of course, policy uncertainty is regulation and geopolitics and energy security. This can affect that trade and also that the demand, because if geopolitical tension increases, that it's going to be the demand from that the consumer is going to go into towards a reliable source, which is potentially coal, which is not particularly clean. Yes, I think. So to conclude that natural gas and renewable will play an important role despite a lot of uncertainty in the policy and the technology. And policy and technology will determine the path, speed, share towards new world order of energy market. And we expect that the carbon tax is needed quite high level to reduce the use of fossil fuels, at the same time to stimulate research on CCUS technology that can potentially save fossil fuels as well. So there's some trigger. One of the things that triggers from policy side is carbon tax. Thank you very much.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much, Akito, for that presentation as well. Now we come to the part where the audience can participate. And I hope you'll agree with me that there is a lot for us to probe here. We've had 3 presentations by 3 gentlemen who represent, like I've been pointing out, not only some of the most astute minds in the business, but also that they have such a direct role in influencing and shaping policy when it comes to the energy industry, when it comes to the energy transition. So let's start off by giving a warm hand of thanks to all of them for their presentations. Now, we've got about 10 minutes or 12 minutes. I'd like to invite you to pose your questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. And we've got the first one up already. We'll get a microphone to you. I'd like to ask you, of course, to remember to state your name and professional affiliation and to whom your question is directed. Go ahead, please.
Good morning to everyone. My question is targeted to Dr. Akito. You mentioned in your presentation like the carbon tax in Europe or in EU will affect the trade and there will be a trade war between the consumer and producers. Can you elaborate how would the carbon tax will affect the trade?
So carbon tax is typically charged at the consumer side, so that if there's a carbon tax introduced, let's say that the European side, Europeans get a lot of tax revenue. Of course, consumers get affected by higher price, but the government can get tax revenue. They can kind of redistribute or they can cut income tax, while producer countries gonna get affected by higher carbon tax through the lower producer price and lower demand. So they basically lose from this. They don't gain anything from carbon tax introduction from consumer country, and they reduce demand, and they probably face lower price. So that's the cost of carbon tax introduction. And in the IMF, we are discussing that this is potentially unfair, and we probably need to provide some help for that the country in the distress situation. But this one that if we just introduce as is, there can be potential redistribution effect among countries, and that's the risk of for many countries.
Brilliant. We've got a gentleman in the front row here. Please go ahead with your question, sir.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My question to Mr. Dr. Paul, you mentioned that the human had transition from wood to coal, then we will go now for the renewable energy. Some say it's a little bit exaggerated when we talk about this transition, and as Dr. Cyrill said also, we cannot keep away from oil. It's everywhere in our life, also in our products. Also, I worked on energy transition in my country, in Algeria, and they have a program until 2030 to go to the mixed energy to produce electricity. But unfortunately, until now, they didn't reach 10% of their goals. It's a little bit exaggerated to talk about this. And as part of Middle East, we see it's kind of Occidental ideas in this geopolitical, what we call conflict between the Occidental part and Middle East regarding the oil as main source for these countries. And we know this history of conflicts. Is it part of this conflict, geopolitical conflict, internationally speaking?
All right, go ahead. So are we exaggerating the transition?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair comment, and it's a question of the timing of it. I take the view that it will be faster and deeper than the establishment believes, and that it will accelerate as more and more renewables come into play. I mean, if you look at European oil demand, and I disagree with Cyrill here, I mean, the OECD oil demand has peaked. It peaked in 2004 and has been generally on decline since then. And okay, there are a number of uses, obviously aviation is one of them, where oil will remain and retain its advantage simply because of its energy density. But having said that, there is lots of scope for moving away from oil as an energy source. Now, okay, the counter to that, which comes particularly from the IEA, and it's been made here this morning, to say, well, of course, oil is not just about energy, it's about other things as well, like plastics. But again, and maybe this is rather a Eurocentric view of the world, many people are suggesting that plastic is the new tobacco, and there's growing opposition to it, and there's a lot of issues to do with single-use plastic. And again...
Do we have an alternative, Professor Stevens?
Well, it depends. In terms of single-use plastic, yes. I mean, when you think that something like 20% of plastic use goes into packaging, you know, it doesn't take a genius to work out that you can use much less in a packaging situation. And again, technology here is likely to play a role.
All right, do we have any other questions? While we're perhaps pondering it, I have a quick thought for Cyrill. You pointed out in your presentation that we're heading towards that crisis, and that beautiful picture you had of the ship heading into the eye of the storm. Why? If, as you pointed out, demand is increasing. It's never decreased in the last century. So briefly, before we wrap this one up.
The main issue is that demand is there, reserves are there. However, the financing of exploration and production is a huge issue. Major international banks have signed last months in New York that they will slowly divest their investments in oil and gas upstream. Pension funds are increasingly indicating we are not going to be investing in oil and gas, even that you can argue that's a political statement and reality is sometimes something else.
But Cyrill, aren't those investments, one might say, going into renewable energy resources, other things that can meet that growing demand?
If that would be the case, I could argue that would be a good thingy. Investments in renewables, including EVs, etc., is not as high as everybody was thinking. Subsidies on EVs, yeah, because if we say demand for oil is going to be hit hard, EVs projections in the end, official figures for 2040 is that 13% of all vehicles on the road in 2014 are going to be EVs, which means 87% is using the normal gas and oil option. At the same time, I'm seeing everywhere in the media, China is going to go for EVs. Norway, Germany, etc. I'm from the Netherlands. We were leading officially in EVs. The demand for EVs is going down because of one single reason. In Europe, EVs are growing normally when subsidies are being given so that an EV is cheaper than the other cars. When subsidies are removed because we are not able to pay the subsidies, that's the main issue. Then EVs, you see demand of new EVs is down. China EV strategy has been closed, has been cancelled. India is officially heading for EVs. The main issue is you do not have access to electricity in India. So yes, I can buy an EV, but I cannot charge my EV, so there is no room. So all of these issues are not going to be taken in. We are forcing financial institutions, the Goldman Sachs and the Citibanks and the ABN AMROs, to keep away from oil and gas. We force them to go into renewables. There is no grid. There is not enough options. Consumers in Europe are not EV hungry.
Oh, that's an interesting point. If I can, let me bring Akito into it and ask the question of why then are we not seeing that investment flow? Since you handle commodities at the IMF, maybe you can explain to us why. Well, why are we not seeing that investment that's draining out of fossil fuels, renewables, going into some of the renewable energy sources? And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, I want to see some hands, so please keep the thought process coming. Go ahead, Akito. Please.
So it's kind of matter of balance that we really need the investment on the renewable as well as actually the fossil fuel that the oil demand that we are expecting to demand is going to decline, as I said. Even in the declining stage, without proper investment, we can't support that this decreasing demand. We are expecting that the demand is going to going down to, let's say, 100 to next year 99. If it's decreasing with like 1%, which is reasonable assumption in the future, the natural declining of oil without investment is 6%. So without catching up this declining speed with that just slower decline of demand, we need the oil investment. So we need investment in the oil sector. That's for sure. So that's why we need the investment in the oil. And especially like natural gas, which is, we don't see that demand peaking up anytime soon. We need a big investment. So the divestment from financial side is in some sense affecting this balance, and which is good thing that towards the climate change. So that's a good recognition. On the other hand, we need some money going to that sector with a little bit of higher interest rates so that they're gonna get a little bit hit from there. So that's matter of balance. And that, I think, market is working in some sense nicely.
All right, do we have any other questions from the floor? This is your opportunity, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like you to think, all right, keep those thoughts. Maybe we'll transition now as a good time to our next panel of speakers. Let's extend a warm hand to this panel as we invite them to take their seat in the front row. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm told that there is actually a plaque of honor to be presented to you. So, sorry, yeah, let me get Gamza come in on this.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite our honorary board member, Mr. Hakan Kaldırım, Osman Kaldırım, onto the stage to present a plaque of honor to our distinguished speakers.
Değerli misafirler, bu sene üçüncüsünü yaptığımız Aljazeera Vakfı'yla enerji oturumları inanıyorum ki uzun yıllar devam edecek. Ekselansları Aljazeera'nın 3 sene önce beraber imzaladığımız MO'yla önümüzdeki 5 sene boyunca bu enerji oturumlarına devam edeceğiz. Ben kendisine buradan teşekkürlerimi bildiriyorum. Değerli dostum Reda, inşallah bundan sonraki yıllarda Aljazeera'nın da burada olmasını diliyorum ve kendilerine sağlık diliyorum. Sağlık sorunlarından dolayı Mısır'a gelemedi bu sene. Biliyorsunuz, benden iyi biliyorsunuz çünkü siz enerji uzmanlarısınız. Dünyada enerji konusunda imzasını atmış çok önemli bir kişi. Ekselansla Atiya'ya bir daha acil şifalar diliyorum. İnşallah bir dahaki yıl kendisini burada ağırlarız. Mr. Reda da bu organizasyonda büyük katkısı olduğu için kendisine de teşekkür ediyorum. Tekrar hoş geldiniz.